All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our short video introducing logical fallacies. Now, some of you may have studied these a little bit before if you took a philosophy class. And the goal of this video lecture is just to give you some insight into kind of why and how some logical fallacies are made. So, in essence, a logical fallacy is simply a fault in logic. That's to say there's an error in reasoning that's either intentional or unintentional. And we just want to be able to recognize some of them and avoid making them if we can. So logical fallacies, we're also going to talk about inductive and deductive reasoning a little bit. Again, big overview, a lot to cover. So just kind of bear with it. There will be a short quiz on logical fallacies, but there are only 5 of them that I'm really going to ask you to focus on. So let's kind of back up for a minute. So persuasion works best, I think, when we use sound and logical reasoning, right? We don't want the reader or listener to say, hey, wait a minute, that argument doesn't make sense, because once they do that, they're going to, either stop reading or stop listening or whatnot, and then we cannot persuade them. And I will say that almost all writing uses some element of persuasion, and a research essay is really no different. So if we think about this as a type of persuasion, we think about, we're really in the process of trying to persuade people all of the time. And I like to think of it as trying to persuade people to know, think, or do something. Or sometimes they say know, believe, or do something. So how do we persuade people? Well, if you studied ethos, pathos, and logos in a previous English class, that may be your answer. But really, we're talking about kind of word choice and speaker's authority, and then the logos part is logical reasoning, right? And sometimes that's simply the evidence that we're presenting, but also the way that we're presenting the information, which is what I'm interested in this particular video lecture. And one of the things that I think is really helpful as a starting point is to think of a research essay as a piece of writing that is trying to identify and potentially solve a problem. So if you were, did a country report or something like that in middle school, where you were assigned a country and you said, here's their religion, here's their population, here's the size of the country, all of that is good, but it's really just information, and there's no impetus, there's no reason to do anything with the information. With a research essay, I would say a good way to think about it is we want to identify a problem, we want to explain why it's a problem, and then we want to provide some sort of solution. And it doesn't have to be a complete solution. It can be simply a suggestion or a course of action that we could take next. So for example, let's say world hunger is a problem that you've identified and you want to explain why it's a problem. Great. But you don't necessarily have to solve world hunger. You could just simply say, here are 1 or 2 steps that we could take to begin to alleviate this particular problem. So I like to use the analogy of a house on fire as a way to sort of frame this first part. So saying, hey, your house is on fire is not a solution. We can see that the house is on fire, right? Or we can hear it, or we can smell the smoke or whatnot. So again, this identifies a problem, but there's really nothing to do with that problem yet. So one way to do this is to think about the why. So the first part of a research essay is really to figure out a problem, what the problem is. So observation, the house is on fire. Now, why might this be a problem? Well, any number of reasons. Grandma's still in the attic. We don't have anywhere else to go. Or maybe, we're out of marshmallows. And, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because without marshmallows, that fire is a complete waste. Now, what might we do to solve the problem? Well, we could just simply send somebody to the store for more marshmallows. Now, one thing to think about here is the nature of the problem is relative to the person, right? That is to say, if it is not my house, and it's not my neighbor's house, and it's not the house of anybody I know, and that house is in a completely different state, I'm not going to be compelled to act, right? If I took that same problem and said the cause of the house fire was that people were trying to cook marshmallows in a toaster or whatever they were trying to do, then we could say, hey, other people shouldn't do this. But again, think about who the audience is, and you'll hear me say this a lot with audience awareness, because if we're talking to a group of people, they should be people that their knowledge or their ability to do something is going to change the outcome, right? Is going to influence the problem, begin to solve it in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so let's look at an essay-based example, right? And one that kind of connects to our course focus, because we talked about how what makes us human could cover a lot of different things. And maybe one of the things we want to talk about is artificial intelligence. And again, we need to narrow that a little bit more or a lot more. And maybe we want to worry about artificial intelligence and the economy, in particular jobs. So our claim or observation is that artificial intelligence is going to take all of our jobs. Okay, that is a problem, but it's always best to sort of take a breath, right? Slow down and explain why that is a problem, right? Maybe that problem is as simple as if they take our jobs, we won't have jobs. Now, why is this something that we should do something about, right? Well, if we don't have jobs, then we will be poor and we won't be able to survive or afford marshmallows. Okay, fair enough. Now, what can we do about this? Well, one of the possible solutions would be to say, hey, we need to begin legislation to limit the number of jobs that AI can work or find other jobs for people to do in the meantime. Again, all of this needs to be in a very logical progression, and we can't leap to the conclusion that AI is going to take our jobs unless we have evidence that points to that being an actual risk. It's easy to worry about, but there is, of course, a lot of experts who say, it sounds possible, but it may actually be beyond the realm of what we're capable of, and it may not happen in the next 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. It all just kind of depends. So the next thing that we'll kind of talk about here as we're thinking about how we solve these problems is to look at something that's interdisciplinary, which is what I really like to do, is to say, let's move beyond just this narrow frame of what is an English course, and let's look at how other disciplines would solve this type of problem. Well, if you're a science major or you've taken science classes, you're probably familiar with the scientific method. And I find that although we call it the scientific method, and we could go into where it comes from and the structure of it and all of those things, in essence, the scientific method is very similar to what we were doing with a research project, right? We are asking a question or addressing a problem. So that question, that research question might be, will AI develop to the point at which it could take all our jobs? Or we could address a problem. Hey, AI is already taking jobs in, transport and manufacturing industries. The next thing to do is to do a little bit of research into that, right? Going out, reading some sources, good quality popular sources or academic sources. And once we've done that, we begin to form a hypothesis, which is a lot like a working thesis statement. I believe that, or something along those lines. And again, not a thesis, but just a working thesis. Then in our sort of terminology or parlance, we would say we need to do more research, which is the experiment, and then analyze that. And then we can go back to research if we need to, or we can move to the conclusion, which in our case would be creating that actual paper, right? So if we kind of take an overview look of this, a bird's eye view of this, the way that the scientific method applies to English, at least as I teach it, is that the phases of the scientific method actually line up really nicely with our sort of general process that we'll be going through. So we're going to ask a question. So that's a research question. We're going to conduct some basic research. Maybe that's kind of casual or passive research. Then we're going to craft that hypothesis. We're going to do some additional research. We're going to refine that thesis and organize information. And then we're going to create a conclusion. And again, all of this kind of lines up with the assignments as well. So the interest area paragraphs are kind of the same as asking a question. And then, the research writing or the research essay is really synthesizing or bringing all of this information together. So a couple last thoughts here, right? So the idea is the same. That is, the general approach is the same. So unless you're already an expert on a topic, you're going to need to do more research. And I'd say in the number of times that I've taught this class, there's always something to be learned. Nobody has yet come into class enough of an expert to write that essay without any resources. And in addition to having the information, you need to be able to back up your claims, right? So after that initial research, you're going to kind of begin to build your hypothesis. You're going to test that hypothesis with additional research. And in the past, what I do find happens quite often is the hypothesis that you start with is changed or altered by the research. That's well and good. That is a natural trajectory. So if your hypothesis changes in response to your research, you are on the right track. And then once you come to a conclusion related to your hypothesis, that's where you're going to kind of have your nice solid thesis statement. All right. So there you go. I'll end this video here in the interest of time. But if you have any questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, please let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you all in the future.